I'm Morgan Rote. I'm the Director for U.S. Climate Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. And I have here with me Dr. Ilissa Ocko, who's our Senior Climate Scientist at EDF, where she leads our climate science team and serves as the Barbara Streisand Chair of Environmental Studies, which is my favorite title that we have at EDF. Dr. Ocko has her PhD and MA in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences from Princeton. She has more than 15 publications on the warming potential of short-lived climate pollutants, the temporal trade-offs in policy debates, and the climate impacts of methane and now hydrogen emissions. Ilissa will be providing an overview of the challenges of hydrogen emissions and what we're thinking in terms of addressing it. We have 30 minutes for this presentation, so that gives us plenty of time for a Q&A session. To hear your questions, to get your feedback on what you're seeing in your operations, and to discuss mitigation opportunities. So Ilissa, over to you.
Thank you, Morgan. Okay, so really happy to be with you all today to talk about this really important topic. I'm going to give a brief overview before we then dive into more discussion afterwards. So why do hydrogen emissions matter? Well, we all know hydrogen is quite flammable, so obviously there are safety hazards associated with hydrogen emissions. It can catch fire, it can explode. Of course, if we lose hydrogen, it's an economic loss. There are costs associated with that. We all know it is not cheap to make hydrogen, and so we don't want to lose hydrogen and then lose the value of producing that hydrogen. And then finally, something that there is less awareness of is this issue of hydrogen emissions actually causing climate warming. And so there's very little awareness of this topic, so it's something that I am going to go into in a little bit more detail so that everyone's kind of up to date on the latest science of this. And so this is my area of expertise. As Morgan said, an atmospheric scientist. I research atmospheric chemistry and atmospheric radiation. And the science behind hydrogen's warming effects has been known for decades. So this isn't new science, but at the same time, there is very little awareness of this issue, especially when we started looking into this a few years ago. We talked to dozens of experts in the hydrogen industry, and no one had even heard of it, even though scientists had been researching this for more than 20 years. So I'm going to start with a little bit more about how hydrogen warms the climate. Hydrogen itself is not a heat-trapping gas in the way that carbon dioxide is, for example. It impacts the climate by increasing amounts of other greenhouse gases. So essentially, what happens is this one chemical reaction in the atmosphere that triggers a number of warming effects. So when hydrogen is emitted into the atmosphere, the majority of it is taken up by microbes in the soil. But around 30% of that hydrogen remains in the atmosphere for a few years until it meets a hydroxyl radical that is naturally occurring in the atmosphere. And when this process happens, as I said, there's a number of different pathways that lead to a warming effect. So first, when hydrogen reacts with hydroxyl, that means there's less hydroxyl to react with methane. And that is the main sink of methane. So what causes methane to break down in the atmosphere is the presence of this radical. And so if you have less of this radical available, then the methane, which is a powerful, short-lived climate pollutant, can warm the climate for a longer period of time. Second, the production of atomic hydrogen, which is very reactive in the atmosphere and down on the surface of Earth, ends up leading to a chain of chemical reactions in the troposphere that produce ground level ozone. And ground level ozone is not just an air quality concern, but it also is a potent, short-lived greenhouse gas as well. So now you have warming from both methane and ozone. And then when this reaction occurs in the upper atmosphere, in the stratosphere, that additional water vapor that's produced has a meaningful role on Earth's energy balance. And it ends up warming the climate in a way that it wouldn't if this reaction was just occurring on the surface of the Earth, or near the surface of the Earth. So as I said, the science about this has been known for decades. There has been a lot of advancements, though, in the science over the past couple of years, and scientists are confident that hydrogen warms the climate when it's emitted into the atmosphere, and the latest science suggests that it has a global warming potential of 37 over a 20-year period and 12 over a 100-year period. What that means is that when you emit just a one-time pulse of hydrogen, if you were to emit the same amount in mass of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen over the following 20 or 100 years can warm the climate this amount of times more than that CO2 can. So this is not insignificant, and it's definitely a reason for concern, but again, the science is robust, which is why we need to include it in our decision making and be aware of it. Now, at the same time, how much of an issue this is depends on how much hydrogen we emit. If we really are very tight with our systems, we make sure that the hydrogen isn't emitted, then these warming effects aren't that big of an issue. The problem is that hydrogen is the smallest molecule in existence. It is so tiny, you could actually fit 500,000 hydrogen molecules side by side in the width of just a single strand of thin human hair. Thick human hair could be 1 million. So it is so hard to hold on to. And we are planning on building up the hydrogen infrastructure, distributing it all over the place. So there are a lot of opportunities for it to escape into the atmosphere. And it's not just from leakage, it's also when we do operational releases like venting and purging. So this is reason for concern. So how much hydrogen is emitted today? Well, the bottom line here is that we really have no empirical data. We have not been measuring total hydrogen emissions from venting, purging, and leakage from the entire value chain, from all the different components, from site-wide emissions. There definitely are estimates that are out there, but there really is no data on the full extent of how much hydrogen is emitted today, let alone in the future. The sensor technology also isn't available to do the types of measurements that I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about hydrogen emissions that could pose a safety risk. So they're emitted in large concentrations, for example. I'm talking about small leaks that are all over the place that in the aggregate really add up, which is an issue we've seen with methane emissions, for example, from the natural gas supply chain. So the good news here is that instruments are under development to be able to precisely measure hydrogen from different components throughout the value chain, site level, plumes, distances away. You don't have to be right on top of the leak to know where it is, for example. So we're getting there, but we're not there quite yet. And the last thing I'll say here is that of the estimates that do exist in the literature, which again are not empirical measurements in the field, there are all sorts of different proxies and models that have been used and lab experiments. There is quite a range in the literature for different emissions rates, depending on where you are in the value chain. So this figure is from a paper that we recently published, peer review, and it synthesizes all of the existing information in the published literature on what potentially the hydrogen emissions rates are today. And you could see that it ranges anywhere from less than 1% to 20% of the hydrogen being lost to the atmosphere. And if you were to look closely at this, which I understand is hard depending on where you're sitting, the liquefaction and handling of the liquid is responsible for some of those higher level estimates that you were seeing. So what does all of this mean? Well, we also published a study a year ago that looked at if we have a range in hydrogen emissions, let's say 1% on the lower end and 10% on the upper end, well, what would this actually mean for the climate when we replaced fossil fuel technologies with their hydrogen counterparts? And so if you just want to look at the left side in the gray box right now, we looked at this generalized case study of you have a set of fossil fuel technologies that can be replaced with hydrogen counterparts. And what would happen if we avoid the carbon dioxide emitted from those fossil fuel applications and you replace it with either blue or green hydrogen, so blue being natural gas with CCS and green being from renewables with water. And then you have, for the blue, you have methane emissions that that come from just getting the natural gas, either from producing that natural gas or getting it to your SMR facility, for example. We had a 1 to 3% methane emissions rate for that. But then what I really want to focus on here today is the hydrogen emissions and how that affects the climate impacts. And so for that, we looked at this 1 to 10% hydrogen emissions rate. And so basically from your green hydrogen, the only climate impacts you're getting are from the hydrogen being emitted into the atmosphere and the warming effects that I showed earlier from the atmospheric chemistry implications. So what you see here on the graph, the bar chart over on the right-hand side of this slide, the x-axis here is the near-term climate impact, so what's happening over the following 20 years after you replace your fossil fuels with hydrogen, and then the long-term, what's happening over the following 100 years. And then the y-axis is looking at what those warming effects are compared to what the fossil fuel technologies would be. So that black line on the top is basically showing you the same impact that the fossil fuel applications would have had. So if you just look at the blue bars right now, you could see that upper end hydrogen and, when I should say the height of these bars represents the best case emissions to the worst case emissions. So worst case methane and hydrogen emissions, you end up in a situation in the near term where you could actually have more warming than the fossil fuel technologies would have had. But I know we're here to focus on the hydrogen emissions, and a lot of that is coming from the methane emissions. So if you look now at the green bars, what you're seeing here is that if we really minimize those hydrogen emissions, we could nearly eliminate the warming effects from the fossil fuel technologies. But if we aren't mindful of the hydrogen emissions and we don't pay attention to how much we're emitting into the atmosphere, we start cutting into those climate benefits that we're anticipating and we think we're getting, because this is not included in assessments right now about how clean hydrogen is. When you look at carbon intensities, when you look at LCAs, this is not included. And what you could see here is in the near term, if we have worst case emissions rates, which are not even as high as I showed you in the previous slide with what the literature can report, then you could end up only reducing your warming effects from fossil fuel technologies by 65%. That is great, but that is not a net zero solution. So we really want to drive this down and maximize the climate benefits of hydrogen, and a big part of that is being aware of this problem. So how do we minimize hydrogen emissions? We've been working with companies and academics for the past couple of years to figure out what to do about this problem. We have a plan of what we think needs to be done. Many of you are also experts in this space. You know far more about a lot of these components that I'm talking about than we do. We would love your feedback and input on where you think minimizing hydrogen makes the most sense, what the potential challenges are to minimizing hydrogen, all of that. We would love that. So this is just a list of what we've compiled so far. And just to walk through it really quickly, we need to develop better sensors that are able to detect small levels of hydrogen emissions and facility level emissions. Then we need to get out there in the field and measure hydrogen emissions from all across the value chain. Then once we know where the emissions are coming from and how much is emitted, we can start considering how to mitigate the emissions. We can identify leakage mitigation measures, and I should say, and we'll talk more about this in the Q&A, there's a lot of things you could do now to mitigate emissions, but we'll know more once we have data. So thinking about venting and purging alternatives, best practices. Then we could potentially even have emissions programs like we do with methane now from natural gas operations. We can have monitoring, reporting, verification, leak detection, and repair programs. So that's MRV and LDAR for those familiar with those systems. And then finally, we just need to start including this issue in our decision making, incorporating emissions risks into decisions on where and how to best deploy hydrogen, incorporating it into LCAs. The science is robust enough now about hydrogen's warming effects to start including it in our accounting of hydrogen's effects. So there's a lot we can do right now. There's more that we can do in the near term, and I will turn it back to Morgan. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilissa. So we'll move into a question and answer session as well as sort of a brainstorm if we have time for it, because we'd love to hear from you all about what you're seeing in your operations and how we can be helpful. So we have a microphone at the back. So first of all, does anyone have any questions for Ilissa on the presentation? Oh, let's get you first back there, and then we'll come up to the front.
Hi, thanks. Just a quick question on, I think it was 2 slides ago, where you showed the status quo. What is your assumption in regards to methane leakage? Oh, I'm sorry, so go forward one more. This one, yeah. When you say same impact, what's your assumption on methane emission leakage there?
From the fossil fuels or from the blue hydrogen?
From the fossil fuel.
From the fossil fuel. So here, we are assuming that it's all CO2. In the paper that is on the bottom, we have a separate figure that looks at different, it's a sensitivity test for how much natural gas technologies you are now replacing with your hydrogen alternatives. Because basically, it depends on what the fossil fuel technology is, how much methane will be avoided. And based on the data that we used to go into this analysis, we did not have that breakdown. We only had it all as CO2. So what we did was have this sensitivity test where we looked at, okay, now you vary different CO2 emissions levels in parallel with what then the methane emissions levels would be, and you look at the same kind of thing. And what you see is it's definitely better. The more natural gas systems that we are replacing with hydrogen, because you're also avoiding those methane emissions, which we also include a 1% to 3% range for, you do get more benefits. You can end up in situations, though, where it's still pretty much the same amount of warming, and that has to do with the efficiency. You're using natural gas as both a feedstock and for your energy source. There's efficiency losses there, so and the hydrogen doesn't have as high of an energy content as natural gas. It has about 1/3 per volume. So when you incorporate all these stuff, it gets very complicated, but we do account for that in the study.
Got it. So just to clarify, so we're not factoring in methane emission
No,
leakage
this is
from this.
just the CO2.
Yeah, got it, okay.
And it's an average, so it's 11 kilograms of CO2 is avoided per 1 kilogram of hydrogen deployed.
Great, thank you.
Up in the front.
First, thank you for a great presentation. It's just remind me with the saying of yesterday's solutions are today's problems. And I don't want us to fast forward a decade from today and just discover that all that hydrogen produced is going to cause that. So from your perspective, how seriously this is adopted by federal and state level to make this as part of like real codes and standards or regulations instead of just being an academia kind of thing?
Yeah, I think this is relevant for many different audiences. It's relevant for companies to know to adopt into their operational plans, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. It's definitely relevant for policymakers, and we've been putting this on the radar of Department of Energy, Treasury. It's relevant for the amount of money that you're providing to, the amount of incentives you're providing to companies, which is based on greenhouse gas intensity. It's also relevant for investors because they, if they're aiming for ESG goals, sustainability goals, then this is directly relevant and sort of has an impact on the climate effects of their investments. So we're trying to put this on the radar across the board. And I can answer more specific questions afterwards, maybe if.
Yeah, I'm just going to add on to what Morgan said. So at Environmental Defense Fund, we've been working on the methane challenge from natural gas supply chains for over a decade now. And so in that situation, the infrastructure was already built out all over the place, and we basically have to run around the world now and fix leaky pipes. So right now, because hydrogen is in its infancy, we have this opportunity to get ahead of this issue. Mm-hmm. So we've learned so much from that experience with methane. And so you said, yesterday's solutions are today's problems. Like, we are looking ahead with what happened with methane, and we don't want to get to a point where that happens. So that's why we're trying to take into account all this information now. And I will say we do have another study that looks, so this was specifically, and this is relevant for the last question about is methane leakage included in this. We do have another study that will be coming out soon that is a case-by-case life cycle assessment analysis. And so for that, we absolutely include, we look at specific end-use applications, and we do the same analysis looking at the warming effects over time, including hydrogen emissions, including different leak rates depending on where you are regionally. And we look at all the different climate pollutants that are being emitted from those specific fossil fuel technologies and their hydrogen alternatives. So this was a very high level first step to get this information and knowledge out there. And now we have more sophisticated analyses that we'll publish and it's relevant to what you said in terms of regulatory approaches and everything, because it will show that you could have 40% higher warming impacts by including hydrogen emissions in these LCAs than you're getting right now. So a lot of cases, you'll see an LCA where it looks like hydrogen technology and electrification technology have similar climate benefits when compared to the fossil fuel alternatives. And what we find is once you include these other things and you look at different timescales and you look at hydrogen emissions, well, it totally tips the scale in the favor of electrification. And that's not included right now in these big decisions that are being made, and the greenhouse gas intensity and whatnot. And so that we're working towards that goal.
Yeah. What about question in the back over there? Oh, go ahead.
So nice presentation. So my question is about the sensing. So the gas detection and sensing is a very complicated subject. So we are still looking at sensing the hydrogen at the source. And now you're talking about the leakages, which requires a lot of accuracy. And we may have to look at the technologies which are completely different from what we do today. So I call them tier 2 and tier 3 technologies. So most of the fundings and partnerships from the governments around the world are available for tier 1 equipment manufacturers. So how can we bring it down to the level of tier 2 and tier 3, where we see the importance of development at that level?
I'm not familiar with the different tiers, so I don't know how relevant this answer will be. But DOE is funding a new instrument and is calling for proposals for additional instruments that are capable of this kind of level. We've been working with Aerodyne Research, who is funded by DOE to create this first of its kind sensor that's very precise, and you don't have to be right at the point source. We took that out and field tested it in this past January, and it performed really well. We did a controlled release of hydrogen and drove a truck around and was able to, from the PPB level, very precisely detect how much hydrogen was emitted. So in terms of the funding mechanisms for different developers, that's hard for me to say because I'm just not familiar enough with those different levels.
They've had a few, DOE's offered a few different funding opportunities in the last year at both the early R&D stages through the Earthshot program or the Hydrogen Shot program, as well as for more of the commercialization side of things through the small business, the SBIR program. Happy to talk with you about that more. And then we're of course pushing for even more opportunities like that in the future. But DOE's shown a lot of progress in moving those technologies through to commercialization. Ilissa, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the measurement campaign, which you just teased, but I think that may be relevant for folks here.
Yeah, so EDF is working on a hydrogen measurement campaign. For those of you who may be familiar with Environmental Defense Fund's work with the natural gas measurement campaign that I also briefly mentioned, it's going to be very similar to that. We are working with a number of different companies that represent the entire hydrogen value chain and different end-use technologies, different components. We're also working with universities in both the US and Europe. And we hope to kick off this campaign in January, January 2024, where we will be able to finally gather data on how much hydrogen is emitted today, which will be so helpful for a number of reasons. but will really help us understand how serious of an issue this actually is and help us figure out what are the biggest problem points and how do we mitigate those emissions. I think those are the main things that I wanted to mention about the measurement campaign. Carly Plinus, my colleague, is standing there in the blue dress. If you are interested in participating in the measurement campaign with us, please see her afterwards. We're always looking for partners, but we're really excited to be moving forward with this, and we are going to be using 2 of the instruments designed by Aerodyne Research that we'll take into the field to get these precise measurements.
The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is not just the measurement side of things, but mitigation best practices, stuff that we already know based on like common sense or the methane work that many folks have done. Can you talk a little bit about, best practices for reducing the risk of hydrogen emissions?
Yeah, so there's a lot that we'll be able to do once we start getting the measurements, but there's so much that we can do right now. We have a fact sheet that we've prepared at EDF. It's available on your app. It is linked to this session. I also have some hard copies with me if anyone's interested, and it basically looks at all the different technological fixes that you could do based on what we've learned from the natural gas industry, based on what we've learned from talking to hydrogen experts that are in the field working with these operations. So thinking also just including it in your planning. Like, do we need to vent it, for example? A lot of people think the venting is harmless to the atmosphere. Now that you know it's not, does it need to be vented? We've talked to companies that are like, no, we don't need to vent this specific part. We were just doing it because, we didn't think it was a big deal. So it's rethinking a lot of our plans and re-strategizing.
So we'd love to hear from you all. We'll be available, and we have several other colleagues in the room who are available outside this room to talk, to answer more questions you have, and to hear from you if there's practices that you're aware of that can be helpful for us to know about. Please let us know. We have, as Ilissa noted, we have 2 fact sheets available on the app. One of them is about the mitigation best practices that we're aware of. Again, feedback very much invited. And the second one is about the broader climate impacts associated with hydrogen. We also have an EDF hydrogen website with lots of materials on all of these topics that you're welcome to check out. And please reach out to us with any questions or thoughts that you have. Thank you so much.